To troubleshoot Azure SQL Managed Identity. Start by understanding what Managed Identity is. Managed Identity is a feature in Azure that allows Azure resources to authenticate to Azure services without needing to store credentials in code. In the context of Azure SQL, Managed Identity enables your Azure SQL database to authenticate to other Azure services without requiring you to manage credentials. First, ensure that you have correctly configured Managed Identity for your Azure SQL database. This involves enabling the system-assigned Managed Identity or creating a user-assigned Managed Identity and assigning it to your Azure SQL database. You can do this through the Azure portal, Azure CLI, or Azure PowerShell. Next, verify that the Managed Identity has the necessary permissions to access the target resource. For example, if your Azure SQL database needs to read from Azure Storage, ensure that the Managed Identity has the Storage Blob Data Reader role assigned to it. You can check the permissions by going to the Azure portal, selecting the Managed Identity, and then checking the assigned roles. If you encounter issues with authentication, check the Azure SQL database connection string to ensure that it is correctly configured to use the Managed Identity. The connection string should include the keyword Managed Identity, which indicates that the Managed Identity should be used for authentication. Another common issue is that the Managed Identity is not registered in Azure Active Directory. To resolve this, go to the Azure portal, select Azure Active Directory, and then select App Registrations. Check if the Managed Identity is listed, and if not, register it manually. It is also essential to monitor the Azure SQL database logs for any authentication errors. You can do this by going to the Azure portal, selecting the Azure SQL database, and then checking the logs. Look for any error messages related to authentication, which can provide clues about the issue. To avoid common pitfalls, ensure that you have the necessary permissions to configure Managed Identity and that the Managed Identity has the required permissions to access the target resource. It is also crucial to test the Managed Identity configuration after setup to ensure that it is working as expected. In summary, to troubleshoot Azure SQL Managed Identity, start by verifying the Managed Identity configuration. Check the permissions, and ensure that the connection string is correctly configured. Then, check the Azure Active Directory registration and monitor the logs for any authentication errors. By following these steps and best practices, you can effectively troubleshoot and resolve issues with Azure SQL Managed Identity.